In early 2011, Maria Shriver confronted Mildred Patricia Baena. The confrontation, by the accounts of people with knowledge of what was said and where it happened, was not dramatic. It was quiet. Maria had been noticing a physical resemblance for years, a specific quality of resemblance that becomes, as a child grows older, progressively harder to look away from. She asked directly. Mildred Baena confirmed it. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the father of her son Joseph, who was 14 years old. The son had been in the world for 14 years. He had grown up in the household. Mildred Baena had worked in the Schwarzenegger home for 20 years. She had been present for the births of the couple's children. She had been trusted enough to be woven into the fabric of their daily life. And the secret had been kept maintained with total and absolute compartmentalization for 14 years. When the story became public, the coverage described the situation in the standard vocabulary of celebrity scandal. What the coverage never asked is what kind of person is capable of maintaining that specific secret in those specific circumstances for that specific length of time. The answer is the key that unlocks everything else about Arnold Schwarzenegger. The compartmentalization that allowed the 14-year secret is the same compartmentalization that built everything else. The same capacity that allowed a 17-year-old in the small Austrian village of Thal to decide he would be Mr. Universe and then become Mr. Universe. The same capacity that allowed him to walk into Hollywood with a name nobody could pronounce and a physique nobody knew what to do with and simply refused to accept the industry's assessment of his limitations. The machine, as the people who have known him longest consistently call it, does not selectively apply its capacities. It runs all the time on everything, including the things it should not be running on. And understanding what built the machine and what the machine was ultimately running toward is the thing the official version of this story has never adequately examined. Here is what is actually at stake in examining Arnold Schwarzenegger's story, honestly. This is not a story about a man who achieved extraordinary things and then did something unforgivable. Stories of that structure are the easiest stories to tell because they require no examination. The achievement validates the person until the scandal invalidates them. The honest examination of this story produces something more uncomfortable and more instructive. The portrait of a person for whom the achievement and the damage were not sequential but simultaneous, produced by the same quality, operating on everything in the person's life with the same indiscriminate efficiency. Understanding that portrait is more useful than the scandal version, because the scandal version explains one choice. The honest version explains the entire life. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger was born on the 30th of July 1947 in the small village of Thal near Graz in the Austrian province of Styria. The house was small. The circumstances were modest in the specific way of post-war provincial Austria, a region still clearing the debris, literal and psychological, of a war it had participated in, with a complexity that the subsequent decades of official memory would handle unevenly. His father, Gustav Schwarzenegger, was the local police chief, a man of rigid discipline, physical authority, and, according to accounts that Arnold himself has given in various forms over the decades, a coldness toward his younger son that ranged from indifference to active contempt. Gustav Schwarzenegger had served in the Nazi Party during the Second World War. This is a documented fact, established by historians and confirmed in the public record. Arnold has addressed it in interviews with the particular kind of controlled discomfort that a person develops when they have spent years rehearsing the answer to a question they cannot avoid. He has said that his father was a product of his time and his environment. He has said that he tried to understand without excusing what he has said less directly. But what runs through the accounts of his childhood given by people who knew the family is that Gustav Schwarzenegger was a man who made his younger son feel consistently and without apparent effort that he was not enough. The preference for Arnold's older brother Meinhard was visible to people outside the family. Gustav took Meinhard to football matches and left Arnold behind. He praised Meinhard's accomplishments in front of company and was silent about Arnold's. By accounts from people who grew up around the Schwarzenegger family, the dynamic was not subtle. It was a kind of parental favoritism that leaves marks not because it is violent or dramatic, but because it is ordinary, because it is the background radiation of a childhood rather than a single devastating event. And what it produced in Arnold, this is the part that matters for understanding everything that came after, was not defeat. It produced a fury of ambition, so focused and so cold that it would eventually look to the outside world like pure self-confidence. But people who knew him in those early years will tell you that what drove him was not confidence. It was the need to prove to a father who would never acknowledge it that he was worth something. That specific need, not ambition in the generic sense, but the particular ambition that is fueled by the desire to be seen by the one person who has refused to see you, is a motor that runs differently from ordinary ambition. It does not have an off switch. It does not respond to success in the way that ordinary ambition responds to success. Every achievement feeds it briefly, and then the hunger returns, because the person whose acknowledgement was the original object of the exercise is never the person doing the acknowledging when the achievement arrives. He discovered bodybuilding at 15, and what happened next is one of the most remarkable examples of pure directed will in the history of athletic achievement. He did not simply work hard, he worked with a totality that excluded almost everything else. He trained while other teenagers socialized. He studied the physiology of muscle development with an intensity that his teachers never saw applied to academic subjects. He visualized, this is a detail he has returned to repeatedly in interviews and in his own writing, not just the training but the outcome. He saw in his mind the body he intended to build before he had built it. He treated the visualization as a form of work, as real and as necessary as the hours in the gym. The gym where he trained was not a sophisticated facility. It was an unheated space, and the accounts of those early years include details that make the achievement that followed seem even more improbable. Training in conditions that most serious athletes would find unacceptable, without coaching of the quality that his competitors had access to. He compensated for the external deficits with an internal intensity that people who witnessed it describe with a consistency that is striking. Not just more talented than the other young men who came through that gym, but more committed, more willing to suffer, more capable of converting physical pain into fuel rather than the signal to stop that it is for most people. At 17, he won the Junior Mr. Europe competition. At 20, he became the youngest person ever to win the Mr. Universe title. At 23, he won the first of what would become 7 Mr. Olympia titles. The physical achievement was extraordinary, but the more interesting thing was the psychological machinery behind it. He had found in bodybuilding a system where winning was provable, where the validation he needed could be made objective, where the judges were not his father and could not be accused of bias. He arrived in the United States in 1968 with, by his own account, very little English and a name that nobody in the American entertainment industry believed could ever appear on a marquee. The conventional wisdom of the moment was not subtle about this. He was too big, too foreign, too strange, and his name was actively unusable. The agents and producers who saw him in those early years were not wrong about the obstacles, they were simply wrong about his capacity to remove them. He studied English with the same systematic intensity he had applied to bodybuilding. He took acting classes, he took business classes. He invested the money from his bodybuilding career and from a small bricklaying business he had started with a fellow Austrian into real estate, buying properties in the Santa Monica area at a moment in the early 1970s when the California market was positioned for the kind of growth that would make those investments extraordinarily valuable within a decade. He was building multiple parallel structures simultaneously, the body, the career, the financial foundation, with a level of strategic clarity that most people his age could not have articulated and most people of any age would not have sustained. The real estate portfolio was not luck. It was the same mind that had studied physiology textbooks in an unheated gym in Graz, now studying property records and mortgage instruments with an identical long-term perspective, not trying to make money quickly, but trying to build a foundation that would be impossible to remove. The documentary Pumping Iron, released in 1977, introduced him to a mainstream audience and revealed something that the bodybuilding world already knew, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was not simply physically remarkable. He was magnetic in a way that the camera caught and amplified. The competitive psychology he displayed in that film, the mind games, the absolute refusal to acknowledge the possibility of losing, the slightly unsettling quality of his self-belief, fascinated audiences who had never thought about bodybuilding for a single moment in their lives. There is a scene in Pumping Iron that film students and psychologists have used for decades as a teaching tool, and not because of what it shows about bodybuilding. It is the scene where Arnold discusses his strategy for psychologically dismantling his competitors. He talks about it with a specificity and a lack of apparent ethical concern that is both fascinating and quietly disturbing, as if the psychological manipulation of other human beings in the service of his own winning is simply a variable to be understood and deployed, not a moral question to be wrestled with. And the film captures this with an accuracy that the filmmakers may not have fully understood. They were achieving already the Terminator, not the physical version, the psychological version. A person for whom the goal is the only relevant reality, and for whom the question of what effects the pursuit of the goal has on the people around him is simply not part of the processing. Conan the Barbarian in 1982 did not make him a star in the conventional sense. It made him something more durable, an archetype. The role required almost nothing that a traditional acting training would provide, and everything that 20 years of turning a human body into a monument could offer. He was not playing a character. He was presenting a physical reality so extreme that the fantasy around it became paradoxically believable. And then came the Terminator. James Cameron's 1984 film is, in retrospect, one of the most precise pieces of casting in Hollywood history. The role of the Terminator, a machine wearing human skin, moving through the world with complete emotional indifference, executing its program function with total and terrifying efficiency, fit Arnold Schwarzenegger, not merely because of his physicality. It fit him because of something that the camera saw in him that the physicality expressed but did not entirely explain. The quality of absolute purposefulness, the quality of a being for whom obstacles are simply variables to be processed, not experiences to be felt. The Terminator became the defining image of his career, not because it was the best film he made, but because it was, in some essential way, the most honest. Every actor brings something real to their best roles. What Arnold Schwarzenegger brought to the Terminator was not a performance technique, it was a character trait. The emotional indifference of the machine, the capacity to move through the world, executing a function without apparent access to the interior experience that most humans bring to their actions, was something that James Cameron saw in him and cast accordingly. Whether Arnold recognized what Cameron was seeing is a question that nobody has ever put to him directly and received a direct answer. The decade that followed, the Terminator produced a filmography that, measured purely in commercial terms, has few equivalents in the history of Hollywood. Commando, Predator, Total Recall, Terminator 2, True Lies, each of them built on the same fundamental premise: a man who cannot be stopped. A man for whom the normal human experience of doubt, fear, and limitation simply does not apply. He played these characters with a self-awareness that gave them a quality of controlled absurdity. The one-liners, the almost comic invulnerability, the wink at the audience that said, "We both know this is impossible." And isn't that exactly the point? He understood, better than almost anyone in Hollywood, the specific pleasure that audiences take in watching a man do impossible things without appearing to find them difficult. The financial returns on these films were extraordinary. His name had become in the 1980s and early 1990s, genuinely international, one of a small number of English language actors whose face and specific cultural meaning translated across languages and cultural contexts without requiring explanation. He had done to the film industry exactly what he had done to the bodybuilding world and the real estate market. Applied a systematic intelligence sustained over years and across multiple domains to produce results that looked like they had been achieved through some quality that ordinary people do not possess. From the inside, they had been achieved through a quality that ordinary people do possess, but almost never apply with the consistency and totality that he did. The refusal in every context and at every moment to allow the gap between where he was and where he intended to be anything other than a problem to be solved. Maria Shriver entered his life in 1977. She was the niece of President John F. Kennedy, the daughter of Eunice Kennedy Shriver, a woman of significant personal accomplishment and formidable family expectation. She was also a journalist of genuine talent and ambition, a woman who had built her own career on her own terms in a family where the gravitational pull of the Kennedy legacy made that a more complicated achievement than it sounds. They were, on the surface, a spectacular pairing. The immigrant bodybuilder turned movie star and the American political royalty turned television journalist. The wedding in 1986 was covered as an event. People who knew them both during the early years of their marriage describe a relationship that was real and complicated in the ways that all real relationships are. Maria was, by multiple accounts, one of the very few people in Arnold's life who was not intimidated by him, who pushed back, who told him things he did not want to hear, and did so without apparent concern for his reaction. He respected this, people close to them say, in a way that he did not always respect more accommodating relationships. She was also, by the accounts of people who knew her well, a woman who had made significant personal and professional sacrifices to support a husband whose ambitions kept expanding into new territories that required more of her than the previous territory had. The film career had required one kind of support. The political career, which was already being discussed and planned in the 1990s, required a different kind. And the Kennedy family connection, which was simultaneously an asset and a complication in the Republican political environment that Arnold was navigating, required a kind of management that only Maria could provide, and that she did provide at considerable personal cost. His entry into politics was not, as it was sometimes presented, an impulsive decision made in the wake of a recall election. It was, by the accounts of people close to him, something he had been moving toward for years. The Republican Party connections, the policy positions developed carefully over time, the deliberate cultivation of a public persona that positioned him as something beyond conventional partisanship, the action hero who could reach across the aisle, the immigrant who embodied conservative economics and moderate social instincts, the celebrity whose name recognition could do what decades of traditional political work could not. He was elected governor of California in 2003, the recall election that removed Gray Davis, and he served 2 terms until 2011. The assessment of his governorship by people with knowledge of California politics is genuinely mixed in the way that serious assessments of serious political careers tend to be. There were achievements, there were failures, there were moments of genuine political courage. His positions on environmental policy in particular were more substantive than his party's mainstream, and cost him politically in ways that he accepted without apparent resentment. There were also the ordinary compromises and reversals and miscalculations that attend any extended time in elected office. He was, by most accounts, a more thoughtful and more curious governor than the action movie background suggested he would be, and a less effective one than the force of his personal ambition suggested he should have been. The specific quality that had made him so effective in domains that he could approach as individual achievement problems, where his will and his strategic intelligence were the primary determinants of the outcome was less directly applicable to the collective and negotiated processes of democratic governance, where the outcome depends on the cooperation of people who are not subordinate to your will and who have their own constituencies, their own interests, and their own assessments of what is possible and what is desirable. What the 14-year secret actually required, the specific psychological architecture that made it possible to maintain inside one of the most famous marriages in America, across 2 terms as governor of California, in the full glare of public life, is the most revealing thing about Arnold Schwarzenegger that the scandal coverage never examined. Because the architecture is not unique to the secret, it is the same architecture that built everything else. Mildred Patricia Baena had worked as a housekeeper in the Schwarzenegger household for 20 years. She was, by accounts from people who knew the household, a trusted and valued employee, someone who had been present for the births of the couple's children, who had worked through the years of the governorship, who was in many ways woven into the fabric of the family's daily life. In 1997, she gave birth to a son. The boy's name was Joseph. For 14 years, the identity of Joseph's father was not publicly known. When Maria Shriver confronted Mildred Baena in early 2011, the conversation reportedly triggered by Maria noticing a physical resemblance that had become impossible to ignore. As Joseph grew older, Mildred confirmed that Arnold Schwarzenegger was the boy's father. Maria left the family home. The separation was announced publicly in May 2011. The Los Angeles Times, which had been investigating the story, published the details shortly after. Arnold Schwarzenegger confirmed the story in a statement that was, by the standards of celebrity crisis management, unusually direct. He did not use the language of rehabilitation that public relations professionals typically construct for these moments. He said he had kept this secret from his wife, his children, and the public, and that he understood the pain he had caused. The statement was notable for its absence of the kind of contextualizing language, the references to personal struggles, the suggestions of circumstances, the implicit requests for understanding that typically accompany these admissions. The response from people who knew him and who have spoken about it carefully in the years since is interesting for what it does not include. There is very little surprise about the fact of the infidelity itself. What surprised people, what surprised even those who knew him well, was the specific nature of the concealment. 14 years, a child growing up in the same household as his other children, a woman employed in the family home, seeing Maria Shriver every day, maintaining the secret with a consistency that required from both of them a sustained capacity for compartmentalization that goes beyond what most people are capable of. People who have thought carefully about Arnold Schwarzenegger and who have known him across different periods of his life tend to arrive when they discuss this at the same uncomfortable observation. That the qualities that made the concealment possible, the absolute compartmentalization, the capacity to maintain separate realities without apparent psychological cost, the ability to present one face to the world while something entirely different exists behind it, are the same qualities that built everything else. The same qualities that allowed a 17-year-old in Austria to decide he would be Mr. Universe and then become Mr. Universe. The same qualities that allowed him to walk into Hollywood with a foreign name and an impossible physique and simply refuse to accept the industry's assessment of his limitations. The machine, in other words, does not selectively apply its capacities. It runs all the time on everything, including the things it should not be running on. The compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain the professional persona while privately negotiating the real estate investments, while publicly presenting the film career, while internally developing the political ambitions. That same compartmentalization allowed him to maintain the family life publicly while privately sustaining a parallel reality that included a child growing up 30 feet from his other children. The mechanism is the same. The domain it was applied to is different. The psychological architecture behind it is identical. The divorce proceedings between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria Shriver lasted for years and were, by accounts from people with knowledge of the legal process, considerably more complex than the public narrative suggested. The financial arrangements, the custody agreements, the division of a shared life built across 25 years, these were not simple matters, and the process of resolving them was not brief. They reached a settlement in 2021, a decade after the initial separation, a timeline that speaks to the depth of what had to be disentangled. His son, Joseph Baena, who has his father's build, his father's jawline, and what people who know him describe as his father's specific quality of relentless forward motion, became publicly known in the years after the story broke, and has since built his own career as an actor and fitness personality. He and Arnold have been photographed together. They have spoken publicly in careful language about the relationship they have developed. It is, by all accounts, genuine. It is also, by all accounts, complicated in the way that all things built on top of a 14-year secret inevitably are. Arnold's other children, the four he had with Maria Shriver, have navigated the aftermath in different ways and at different paces, as the people who are most directly affected by a parent's concealment tend to do. The public accounts from some of them suggest a process of reckoning that is ongoing, as these processes generally are when the foundation of a family's shared understanding of its own history is substantially revised. Arnold Schwarzenegger's public life after the governorship has been a study in the specific resilience of people who have decided at a very deep level that the story they are living will not end in the way that other people's stories end. He returned to acting. He produced, he maintained his physical presence in the world, still training, still appearing, still projecting the quality of indestructibility that has always been his most marketable asset, with a consistency that people who observed it found either admirable or unsettling, depending on their own relationship to the question of what it means to keep going after the specific kind of public unraveling that would have ended many careers and many public identities entirely. He had open heart surgery in 2018 to replace a pulmonary valve, a procedure that was, in the accounts of people close to him, considerably more serious than his public statements at the time conveyed. He described it afterward with characteristic directness and characteristic minimization. A man who had spent his entire life treating his body as an instrument to be optimized rather than a vulnerability to be acknowledged was not going to begin acknowledging vulnerability in his 70s. But people who saw him during his recovery described someone who was, in private moments, more reflective than the public version suggested, more aware of the arithmetic of time, more willing, in the specific and bounded way that serious illness sometimes produces in people who have spent their lives managing their own image, to sit with the experience of limitation rather than immediately converting it into motivation. Arnold Schwarzenegger has spent his entire life proving something to a man who died in 1972 when Arnold was 24 years old, before any of the achievements that were supposed to constitute the proof. Gustav Schwarzenegger died in a car accident and never saw his son become Mr. Olympia, never saw him become a Hollywood star, never saw him become the governor of California. The father who preferred the other son, who produced in him the specific fury of ambition that drove everything that father, was gone before the proof was ready. And the machine has been running toward a destination it can never reach ever since. Arnold Schwarzenegger has spent his entire life proving something to a man who died in 1972 when Arnold was 24 years old, before any of the achievements that were supposed to constitute the proof. Gustav Schwarzenegger died in a car accident and never saw his son become Mr. Olympia, never saw him become a Hollywood star, never saw him become the governor of California, never saw any of it. The father who preferred the other son, who made the younger one feel invisible, who produced in him the specific fury of ambition that drove everything that father, was gone before the proof was ready. People who have been close to Arnold Schwarzenegger across different periods of his life and who have spoken with the kind of candor that only becomes possible in private and only after a long time, describe a man who is aware of this, who understands at some level that he does not often access in public, that the machine has been running toward a destination that was removed before the journey was halfway over. That the validation he has spent his life manufacturing in quantities that should have been more than sufficient was never going to reach the one place it was originally intended to go. This does not make the achievements less real. The bodybuilding records are genuine. The films made hundreds of millions of dollars and gave pleasure to hundreds of millions of people across 40 years. The political career was a genuine engagement with the mechanics of governance by a person who had no obligation to subject himself to that particular form of scrutiny, and who did so anyway, imperfectly, with the specific combination of courage and limitation that all political careers display when examined honestly. None of that is diminished by understanding what drove it, but understanding what drove it changes what the whole thing means. It means that the most perfectly constructed public narrative in the history of modern celebrity, the immigrant who arrived with nothing and became everything, the living proof that the American dream still works for the people willing to work for it, is also a story about the specific thing that an extraordinary level of achievement cannot do. It cannot retroactively change the assessment of a man who is no longer alive to revise his opinion. It cannot reach backward through time and make a father see a son who he refused to see when the son was present in the room. It cannot solve the problem that generated it. This is what the machine cannot process. Not because the machine is insufficient by any ordinary measure, the machine is extraordinary, but because the problem it was built to solve does not have a solution that the machine can deliver. The machine can deliver Mr. Universe. It can deliver the Terminator. It can deliver the governor's office and the Kennedy marriage and the global recognition and the financial security and every other external marker of having exceeded the assessment of a man who told a 15-year-old boy that he was worth nothing. It cannot deliver the thing that would make the running stop. And so the machine keeps running. This is not unique to Arnold Schwarzenegger. It is the specific mechanism by which a large number of extraordinary achievements in human history have been produced, the engine of unresolved childhood hunger converted into adult output at a scale that the person who produced hunger could not have imagined and would not have intended. What is unusual about Arnold Schwarzenegger is the scale at which the mechanism operated, the specific ferocity and totality of what the machine built, and the specific clarity with which the story, examined completely, reveals the mechanism at work. Gustav Schwarzenegger looked at his younger son and decided he was not worth the attention. He was wrong in every way that the subsequent 60 years have demonstrated, and it did not help at all. The compartmentalization that allowed the 14-year secret is part of the same picture. It is the machine applied to emotional life. The same capacity that allowed a 23-year-old to maintain multiple parallel development projects, body, career, finances, language simultaneously without allowing any one of them to interfere with the others, applied to the management of parallel emotional realities. The machine does not distinguish between domains. It applies the same architecture to everything. This is simultaneously the quality that produced everything admirable in the story and the quality that produced everything damaging in it. You do not get to selectively deploy the capacity for total compartmentalization. You cannot use it to build the career and then turn it off when it would allow you to sustain a secret that is destroying your family. The qualities that make a person extraordinary in certain domains make them capable of specific and serious damage in others. This is not an excuse, it is an explanation. And the distinction between those two things matters. Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger, born the 30th of July, 1947 in Thal, Austria. Bodybuilder, movie star, governor of California, father of 5. The man who arrived in Los Angeles in 1968 with almost nothing and proceeded to build one of the most remarkable and most carefully controlled public narratives of the 20th century. The man who played a machine wearing human skin and was, in certain important ways, playing something closer to himself than anyone watching understood at the time. The man who kept a secret for 14 years inside the walls of one of the most famous marriages in America, not because he was unusually dishonest, but because he was unusually capable of maintaining separate realities, and that capacity, like all his other capacities, ran without discrimination on everything it was given to run on. The man who has spent 60 years trying to prove something to a father who died before the proof was ready. The man who built everything he ever said he wanted and is still in some private room that the machine has never managed to reach, carrying the unresolved question that started all of it. That story, the full one, the honest one, is not a success narrative interrupted by scandal and redeemed by resilience. It is a human story. The story of a boy who was told he was not enough, who spent 6 decades making himself into the most visible proof imaginable that he was, in fact, more than enough. And who arrived at that proof still carrying, in some private room the machine has never managed to reach, the unresolved question that started all of it. His career, in the years following the governorship and the public resolution of the Padalecki situation, has been, in its own way, a study in the specific resilience of people who have decided at a very deep level that the story they are living will not end in the way that other people's stories end. He returned to acting. He maintained his physical presence in the world with a consistency that people who observed it found either admirable or unsettling, depending on their relationship to the question of what it means to keep going. He had open heart surgery in 2018 to replace a pulmonary valve, a procedure that was, in the accounts of people close to him, considerably more serious than his public statements at the time conveyed. A man who had spent his entire life treating his body as an instrument to be optimized rather than a vulnerability to be acknowledged, was not going to begin acknowledging vulnerability in his 70s. But people who saw him during his recovery described someone who was, in private moments, more reflective than the public version suggested, more aware of the arithmetic of time, the specific quality of self-reflection that serious illness sometimes produces in people who have spent their lives managing their own image, the willingness to sit with the experience of limitation rather than immediately converting it into motivation, was more visible in private than the public performance acknowledged. Subscribe if you didn't know. This was the full story behind one of the most perfectly constructed public narratives in the history of modern celebrity, because the official version was built to protect the achievement, and this channel examines what the achievement was actually built to prove. And if this account of who Arnold Schwarzenegger really is, the machine, the father who died before the proof was ready, and the specific cost of a life lived entirely as a performance of ambition, changed the way you understand every film he ever made and every speech he ever gave. Click the screen right now, because we have other videos featuring famous personalities and their dark secrets and stories that don't usually come to light. If you want to know more, click on our videos and subscribe.